What happens when the person society trusts most with its most vulnerable souls becomes their greatest predator? Welcome to this journey into one of America's darkest and most deliberately hidden scandals. But before we descend into this carefully constructed nightmare, I need you to ask yourself, who do you trust with children? Doctors, teachers, religious leaders? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe that institutions of faith are inherently good, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about charity, motherhood, and the price we put on innocence itself. In the archives of Memphis, Tennessee, there exists a stack of death certificates that shouldn't exist more than 100 infants, all dying in a single orphanage between 1945 and 1950, cause of death listed simply as malnutrition, pneumonia, failure to thrive, all under the care of one woman. All while that same woman was being celebrated in national magazines as a pioneer of modern adoption, praised from the pulpits, invited to presidential inaugurations. We're about to delve into a conspiracy that spanned 3 decades, trafficking an estimated 5,000 children, where a woman claiming to serve God created a black market baby ring that generated over $1 million, the equivalent of 16 million today, built on stolen infants, forged documents, and the systematic destruction of families. This isn't just a story about one monster. This is a question about how an entire city, an entire state, an entire nation could look the other way while children vanished in broad daylight. It was the year 1924. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing across America. Jazz was reshaping music. Women had just won the right to vote, and prosperity seemed within reach for those who could grasp it. But beneath the glittering surface, the divide between wealth and poverty was becoming a chasm. In Memphis, Tennessee, a river city where wheel steamers still churned the muddy Mississippi, where cotton remained king and the poor remained invisible, that divide was about to become a hunting ground, and the hunter would wear the respectable disguise of a social worker, a woman of education and refinement, a woman society would trust without question. Her name was Georgia Tann, but to truly understand how one woman could orchestrate such devastation, we need to first understand the world that made her possible. Memphis in the 1920s was a city of stark contradictions. Along the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, grand mansions housed cotton barons and merchants who'd grown wealthy on the sweat of others. Their estates sprawled across manicured grounds, protected by wrought iron gates, staffed by servants who knew their place in the rigidly defined social order. These were families who attended the right churches, belonged to the right clubs, married within their class. And many of them faced a problem that money couldn't solve: infertility, or the social disgrace of childlessness in an era when a woman's worth was measured primarily by her ability to produce heirs. But travel just a few miles from those grand homes, down to the shanty towns along the river, and you'd find a different Memphis entirely. Here, in neighborhoods with names like Pinch and Happy Hollow, families crowded into shacks cobbled together from scrap lumber and hope. The Depression hadn't hit yet, but for these families, prosperity had never arrived in the first place. Fathers worked brutal hours in lumber mills or on the docks for wages that barely kept hunger at bay. Mothers labored in other people's homes, scrubbing floors and washing clothes, their own children left to fend for themselves or mind younger siblings. Sickness was a constant presence: tuberculosis, typhoid, influenza. And medical care was a luxury reserved for those who could pay. These families had something the wealthy wanted: children, beautiful, healthy babies who came into this world despite the poverty that surrounded them. And they had something else: vulnerability. Georgia Tann understood this economy of desperation with the cold calculation of a predator identifying prey. Born in 1891 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Georgia was the daughter of Judge George Tann, a prominent jurist, and Beulah Yates Tann, a former schoolteacher. From birth, she inhabited a world of privilege and expectation. The Tann family resided in a large Victorian home, employed domestic help, and moved in the highest social circles of their small Mississippi town. Young Georgia was educated at Martha Washington College, receiving the refined education considered appropriate for a young woman of her station. But Georgia Tann was not content to follow the prescribed path for women of her class: marriage, motherhood, quiet domesticity. She had ambitions, intelligence, a vision for her life that extended beyond the confines of a respectable marriage. According to later testimonies and biographical research, she passed the bar exam, dreaming of becoming a lawyer like her father. But Judge Tann forbade it. Law was a man's profession. For a woman of Georgia's social standing, there was only one acceptable career that involved helping others: social work. So social work it became. But from the very beginning, Georgia Tann approached it not as a calling, but as an opportunity. She took her first position at the Mississippi Children's Home Society in 1921, serving as receiving director at the Kate McWillie Powers Receiving Home for Children. It was here that she met Ann Atwood Hollinsworth, a woman 8 years her junior who worked as a house mother. Ann had recently given birth to a son out of wedlock and had appended Hollinsworth to her name, likely to suggest widowhood and avoid scandal. The two women formed a close bond. Some historians believe they became romantic partners, living what was then called a Boston marriage, a relationship between two women who shared a household and a life together. Together, they adopted a baby girl named June Ann, and Georgia began developing methods that would later scandalize the nation. Even in Mississippi, her superiors noticed something troubling about the way Georgia placed children. She showed little concern for matching children with appropriate families. She removed children from their parents without proper cause or documentation. When questioned about her methods, she became defensive, argumentative. In 1924, after just 3 years on the job, she was terminated for what the official record describes as questionable child placing methods. Most people, after such a termination, would retreat, reconsider, perhaps choose a different career. Georgia Tann did the opposite. She saw her firing not as a judgment on her character, but as a limitation on her vision. Mississippi was too small, too provincial, too watchful. She needed a bigger city, more children, less oversight. She moved to Memphis, Tennessee, bringing with her Ann Atwood, Ann's son Jack, and young June Ann. And there, in a city where the desperate far outnumbered the prosperous, where poverty created a constant supply of vulnerable families, Georgia Tann found the position that would define her legacy. She became the executive secretary of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. The Tennessee Children's Home Society, known as TCHS, was a small, struggling organization when Georgia arrived. It consisted of little more than a tiny office and one additional employee, handling primarily administrative oversight of children already placed in various privately run boarding homes scattered across the state. The agency had minimal funding, limited scope, no real power. Georgia Tann transformed it utterly. Her first move revealed the calculating intelligence that would serve her so well for the next century. She understood that to build an empire, she needed alliances with power. So she drove her Model T automobile, an image of modernity and efficiency, all over Memphis, systematically cultivating relationships with everyone who mattered. She charmed the heads of women's clubs, positioning herself as a modern professional woman doing God's work saving children. She befriended local businessmen, offering them the opportunity to support a worthy cause. She cultivated judges, particularly juvenile court judge Camille Kelly, who would become perhaps her most crucial ally. And she built connections with hospital administrators, physicians, and nurses who would prove essential to her operation. Within months, she'd secured increased funding for TCHS. Within a year, she'd expanded the organization's scope dramatically. And within 2 years, she'd begun the systematic trafficking of children on a scale unprecedented in American history. But here's what you need to understand about Georgia Tann. She didn't see herself as a criminal. In her own mind, she was a visionary, a reformer, someone who understood that children were better off with wealthy, educated parents than with poor, ignorant ones. She truly believed that poverty disqualified people from parenthood, that she was rescuing children from lives of deprivation by placing them with families who could provide material advantages. It's this certainty, this absolute conviction in her own righteousness, that made her so dangerous. By 1928, just 4 years after arriving in Memphis, Georgia Tann arranged 206 adoptions. To put this in perspective, another urban children's aid society averaged about 5 adoptions per year in the 1920s. Georgia's success rate wasn't just unusual. It was statistically impossible unless something else was happening. And something else was definitely happening. Georgia had discovered several crucial facts that would shape her operation for the next 2 decades. First, Tennessee law only allowed adoption agencies to charge families living in the state $7 for a child, barely enough to cover administrative costs. But the law said nothing about fees charged to out-of-state families. Second, wealthy families in New York, California, and other distant states were willing to pay enormous sums for healthy white infants, sometimes as much as $5,000 per child. Third, Memphis had an inexhaustible supply of poor families whose children could be taken under various pretexts. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, nobody was watching. Georgia transformed the adoption process into something that resembled luxury shopping more than child welfare. She hired photographers to take professional portraits of available children, dressing them in cute outfits, posing them carefully. She created slick brochures featuring these photographs, each captioned with the child's name, age, and appealing characteristics. Glenn, age 4, recites poetry beautifully. Mary, age 2, exceptional musical talent. Robert, age 5, remarkably intelligent. Most of the information was fabricated. The 4-year old Glenn, who supposedly recited poetry, might actually be a 6-year old named Vernon who couldn't tie his own shoes. But the adoptive parents didn't care. They were buying the fantasy of a perfect child, and Georgia understood that what they wanted most was the feeling that they were getting something special, something exclusive. She made the process as streamlined and pleasant as possible for wealthy clients. She eliminated waiting periods. She handled all the paperwork. She arranged for the children to be delivered directly to the adoptive parents, sometimes meeting them in hotel lobbies in New York or Los Angeles, handing over a baby as casually as one might transfer a package. Tennessee state law required her to investigate adoptive families to ensure they could provide adequate care for a child. Georgia always conducted these investigations because she could charge parents for them, but they were purely theatrical. If a family could pay, they passed inspection. It didn't matter if the husband was an alcoholic, if the wife showed signs of mental instability, if the home showed evidence of previous abuse. Money was the only qualification that mattered. The consequences for the children were often devastating. Many reported being beaten by their new parents. Some described being denied food as punishment. One little boy spent his childhood working 18-hour days harvesting tomatoes. A little girl remembered spending hours locked in a dark closet. Others endured sexual abuse from family members or from Georgia Tann herself. But Georgia had a theory that allowed her to dismiss such concerns. She believed children were blank slates. According to her ideology, babies and young children had no meaningful memories, no emotional attachments, no trauma that couldn't simply be erased by placing them in a new environment. The child's previous life, their biological family, their experiences, all of this was irrelevant. What mattered was the new family's wealth and social status. This belief, this deliberate refusal to acknowledge children's humanity, would enable atrocities. Yet all of this raises a question we need to confront. Where were these children coming from? The official story was that they were orphans, abandoned children, babies whose mothers couldn't care for them and voluntarily surrendered them for adoption. And some were. Georgia targeted homes for unwed mothers, where young women faced enormous social pressure to give up their babies. She cultivated relationships with institutions for the mentally ill, where she could claim that inmates were unfit mothers and remove their newborns shortly after birth. But orphans and voluntary surrenders weren't enough to meet demand. Wealthy families wanted babies healthy, white, beautiful babies, and they wanted them immediately, without waiting lists or delays. So Georgia began taking children from families who had no intention of giving them up. Her methods were sophisticated, varied, and utterly ruthless. Sometimes she or her associates would approach poor mothers directly, offering to take their children for medical care, or a temporary stay at a nice facility, while the family got back on their feet financially. The mothers, trusting in the authority of a professional social worker, would hand over their children. Then Georgia would sell the child and tell the mother it had died. Other times, she'd arrive at poor neighborhoods, identify children playing unsupervised, and simply take them. Her black limousine became notorious in some Memphis communities, mothers learning to pull their children inside when they spotted it prowling the streets. But by the time parents could report their children missing, Georgia had already moved them to her facility, already begun processing them for adoption. She also used hospital partnerships to devastating effect. Poor women giving birth in Memphis hospitals would be told their babies needed special care, that they'd be taken to a facility with better medical equipment. Hours or days later, the mother would be informed that her baby had died of pneumonia or complications or failure to thrive. In reality, the baby had been transferred directly to a waiting wealthy family, often in another state. The death certificates were forgeries. The mothers were given fake burial records, and their children vanished into new lives, new families, new identities, with no record that they'd ever been someone else's son or daughter. In some of the most heart-wrenching cases, families experiencing temporary hardship would place their children in orphanages or boarding homes, expecting to retrieve them once circumstances improved. A father might be hospitalized, a mother might need to work extra shifts, unemployment might require temporary arrangements. They'd place their children in Georgia's care with explicit instructions that this was temporary, that they'd return for them. But when they came back, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months, Georgia would tell them there was no record of their children ever being there. The files had been destroyed. The children had been adopted out. The law gave parents no recourse. Once a child entered the system, once Georgia processed the paperwork through her ally Judge Kelly's court, The biological parents had no rights. And if they protested too loudly, if they threatened to make trouble, Georgia had connections with the Memphis police who would remind them that creating a disturbance could result in their arrest. That poor people making unfounded accusations against respected institutions rarely found sympathetic audiences. The system protected Georgia Tann because the system was making money from Georgia Tann. Judge Camille Kelly was perhaps the most crucial piece of Georgia's machinery. Appointed as Memphis's first female juvenile court judge in 1920, Kelly was celebrated as a progressive reformer, a woman of refinement and education dedicated to child welfare. A national poll in 1948 selected her as one of the 6 most wholesome women in the world, alongside Queen Elizabeth. But behind the public image of maternal wisdom, Judge Kelly was, in the assessment of later investigators, almost certainly profiting from Georgia's operation. She lived an extravagantly expensive lifestyle, far beyond what a judge's salary could support. She oversaw thousands of adoptions processed through Georgia's agency, rubber, stamping paperwork, terminating parental rights, often without the parents even present in court. She knew she had to know, and evidence suggests she was being paid for her cooperation. The arrangement was nearly perfect. Georgia found the children, Judge Kelly legalized the adoptions, and both women grew wealthy while maintaining reputations as selfless public servants. But perfection is brittle, and cracks were beginning to show. By 1935, Memphis had developed the highest infant mortality rate in the United States. Public health officials couldn't understand it. This was a modern city with hospitals, with public health infrastructure, with resources. Why were so many babies dying? The answer was simple. Georgia Tann's Tennessee Children's Home Society. Children in her care were dying at horrific rates. The facility was overcrowded, unsanitary, understaffed. Babies were kept in sweltering rooms during summer, inadequately heated spaces during winter. Those deemed unadoptable, children with disabilities, children considered too ugly. Children past the desirable baby stage were neglected, sometimes deliberately. Some were placed in closets and left there. Some were denied food. Some were left in sunlight until they developed heat stroke. Former employees would later testify that babies were drugged to keep them quiet during transport to adoptive families. That sick children were hidden from health inspectors. That when children died, and they died frequently, the bodies were disposed of quickly, burial records were falsified, and families were told whatever lie seemed most convenient. But here's the truly disturbing detail. Georgia Tann actually used these deaths as part of her operation. When a child died in her care, that death certificate could be used to cover the trafficking of a living child. A poor mother would be told her baby died, shown forged paperwork, while that baby was actually being sold to a wealthy family in California or New York. The death certificate provided the perfect paper trail, explaining why the child no longer existed in Tennessee records. It was elegant, it was monstrous, and it worked for over 2 decades. During this entire period, Georgia Tann was being celebrated. National magazines ran profiles of her groundbreaking work. She spoke at conferences in major American cities. She advised First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt on adoption policy. When President Harry Truman was inaugurated in 1949, Georgia Tann received an invitation recognition of her status as one of America's foremost authorities on child welfare. Meanwhile, back in Memphis, children were starving, being beaten, being sold, disappearing. How does this happen? How does an entire city, an entire state, an entire nation fail to notice atrocity unfolding in plain sight? The answer lies in who we choose to trust and who we choose not to see. But Georgia Tann's operation, vast and sophisticated as it was, required more than just one woman, one judge, and a few allies in hospitals. It required an entire network of people willing to look the other way, to bend rules, to participate in what they must have known, on some level, was wrong. Let's pull back for a moment and examine the machinery. At the Tennessee Children's Home Society facility itself, dozens of employees worked under Georgia's supervision. There were house mothers who cared for the children, or failed to care for them. There were nurses who treated sick babies, or watched them die from treatable conditions. There were administrators who processed paperwork, photographers who documented the children, drivers who transported them across state lines. Some of these people were simply doing their jobs, following orders, perhaps not fully understanding the scope of what was happening. But others knew, they had to know. Former employees later testified about the conditions, the cruelty, the deliberate neglect. One worker recalled being ordered to hang a misbehaving child in a dark closet as punishment. Another remembered being told to starve uncooperative children for weeks at a time. Sexual abuse of children by Georgia herself was reported by multiple survivors decades later, women who'd been small girls in her care, women who could still recall the horror even 70 years later. One survivor, speaking in her 80s, described it this way: "Sexual abuse at the hands of Georgia Tann was presented as your favor. I keep trying to block it all out, but it keeps coming." These weren't isolated incidents. This was the culture of the institution, but the network extended far beyond the orphanage walls. Georgia employed scouts, women who drove through poor neighborhoods in Memphis and surrounding counties, looking for children. Sometimes they'd pose as county health nurses, offering free medical examinations for babies. Other times they'd simply strike up conversations with tired mothers, offer help, express concern. Always the message was the same: your children would be better off somewhere else. Let us help you. The scouts' job was to identify vulnerable families and report back to Georgia. Then Georgia would arrive in her black limousine, projecting authority and respectability, and convince the parents to sign papers they often couldn't read, papers that terminated their parental rights even though they believed they were just authorizing temporary care. If parents proved resistant, if they asked too many questions or refused to cooperate, the scouts would move on to the next family. There was always another family. Poverty provided an endless supply. Doctors and nurses in Memphis hospitals were another crucial component. Some actively participated in Georgia's scheme, identifying newborns whose mothers seemed vulnerable, unmarried women, poor women, women without family support. These medical professionals would separate mother and infant, claim the baby needed special care, and transfer the child directly to Georgia's facility. Other doctors and nurses may have suspected something was wrong, but chose not to investigate, not to question, not to risk their careers by challenging a well-connected institution. And then there were the lawyers, the court clerks, the police officers who made the entire operation run smoothly. Adoption paperwork had to be processed. Birth certificates had to be amended or forged. Death certificates had to be created for children who weren't actually dead. Court records had to be sealed. All of this required cooperation from multiple levels of government bureaucracy. Some were bribed. Some were simply convinced that what Georgia was doing was actually good, taking children from unfit parents and giving them to respectable families. Some may have been blackmailed or threatened, but the result was the same: an entire institutional infrastructure that enabled child trafficking on an industrial scale. Now here's where the pattern completes, where we understand just how deep this went. Georgia wasn't just placing children within Tennessee or even within the South. She'd built a nationwide distribution network. Her assistant, Alma Walton, made regular trips to New York and Los Angeles, traveling on overnight flights when airports were nearly empty, when there would be minimal witnesses. Walton would arrive in these cities carrying multiple infants, checking into hotels, and summoning wealthy clients to lobby meetings where children would be handed over in exchange for cash or checks. These weren't adoptions in any legal sense. They were sales, pure transactions. The wealthy parents would pay George's fees, sometimes $5,000, sometimes $10,000, sometimes more for particularly desirable infants. Georgia would take her cut, give a portion to Judge Kelly, pay off the necessary officials, and pocket the rest. By 1950, investigators estimated she'd made over $1 million through this operation, the equivalent of roughly $16 million in modern currency. And still, somehow, her reputation remained intact. Part of Georgia's genius was understanding public relations. She cultivated an image as a maternal figure, a woman dedicated to child welfare, someone doing difficult but necessary work. She made sure newspapers ran flattering profiles. She gave speeches emphasizing how adoption transformed lives. And she wasn't entirely wrong about that. Some of the children she placed did find loving homes, did thrive with their adoptive families. Those success stories became her shield, the evidence she could point to whenever questions arose. But for every success story, there were tragedies nobody talked about. In 1940, too, a woman named Evelyn arrived at work one morning to find her daughter Cindy missing. Evelyn was a single mother, working as a waitress, doing everything she could to support her daughter. She'd left Cindy at nursery school that morning, as she did every weekday. But when she went to pick her daughter up that afternoon, the school told her that social workers had taken Cindy into custody. No explanation, no warning, just gone. Frantic, Evelyn tracked her daughter to Memphis Juvenile Court, where Judge Camille Kelly had already processed paperwork making Cindy eligible for adoption. Evelyn appeared before the judge, pleading for her daughter's return. She hadn't abandoned Cindy. She hadn't abused her. She was a loving mother who'd simply been working to provide for her child. Judge Kelly listened to Evelyn's pleas. Then she overruled her objections and terminated her parental rights. Cindy vanished into Georgia Tann's system. At first glance, HUNDREDS of Essems to Titus, thousands of times. Poor mothers arriving at hospitals, shopping at markets, leaving children at schools, only to discover their children had been taken. And when they protested, when they demanded answers, they were told they were unfit mothers, that their poverty proved they couldn't care for their children properly, that the state had the right, the duty, to place those children with more appropriate families. The legal system, which should have protected these families, instead weaponized itself against them. But by the late 1940s, the cracks in Georgia's operation were widening into chasms. Doctors began resigning from the Tennessee Children's Home Society in protest over the appalling health standards. They'd watched too many children die from preventable illnesses, seen too many cases of obvious neglect, documented too many mysterious deaths in infants who should have recovered. Their consciences wouldn't allow them to remain complicit. Families who'd been told their children died started comparing notes, realizing that the stories they'd been told didn't match the death certificates, that burial records seemed suspicious, that something wasn't right. Some hired lawyers, some contacted newspapers, some went to the police. And gradually, inevitably, the whispers reached the ears of someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Robert Taylor was an attorney appointed by Tennessee Governor Gordon Browning in 1950 to investigate complaints about the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Taylor was meticulous, ethical, and crucially, he had the governor's full backing. For the first time in 26 years, someone with actual authority was examining Georgia Tann's operation with the intent of uncovering the truth rather than covering it up. What Taylor discovered horrified him. He started by following Georgia's assistant, Alma Walton, on one of her trips to Los Angeles. Walton left Memphis at 3 in the morning when airports were nearly deserted. She carried 4 infants on the plane, babies who, according to Tennessee records, didn't exist. In Los Angeles, she checked into a hotel and began calling wealthy couples who'd been waiting for children. Taylor watched as she came down to the hotel lobby with one baby while a hotel maid stayed upstairs with the others. He watched as money changed hands. He documented the entire transaction. Then he returned to Tennessee and began digging deeper. He discovered that Georgia had placed over 1,200 children for adoption in New York City and Los Angeles alone. He found evidence that she'd charged couples fees for background investigations that were never conducted, stringing families along for months or years, collecting money for adoptions that would never happen. He uncovered property records showing that Georgia owned extensive real estate in Memphis, a large tourist court in Mississippi, and a summer home on the Gulf Coast, all purchased with money that couldn't be explained by her modest salary. He interviewed former employees who described children being drugged, beaten, locked in closets, denied food. He spoke with mothers who'd been told their babies died, mothers who'd never seen burial sites, mothers whose stories contained identical details, suggesting they'd all been told the same lies. He examined death certificates and found that many had been signed by the same small group of physicians, that causes of death often seemed implausible, that the timing of deaths corresponded suspiciously with periods when Georgia needed to provide paperwork explaining why certain children were no longer in her custody. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just adoption fraud. This was systematic child trafficking, forgery, kidnapping, and likely murder. On September 12, 1950, Robert Taylor presented his complete report to Governor Browning. The findings detailed 2 decades of criminal activity, implicating not just Georgia Tann but numerous officials, including Judge Camille Kelly. The governor immediately ordered the Tennessee Children's Home Society closed and instructed law enforcement to begin preparing criminal charges. Georgia Tann would never face those charges. 3 days after Taylor submitted his report, 3 days, Georgia died of cancer at her home in Memphis. The timing was almost too convenient. Some historians have speculated that Georgia, knowing the investigation was closing in, knowing that exposure and prosecution were inevitable, might have taken her own life. Others believe the stress of the investigation accelerated her cancer's progression. We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is this: Georgia Tann died in her bed, surrounded by the property and wealth she'd accumulated through trafficking children. She died respected, her public reputation still largely intact. The newspapers that announced her death described her as a pioneering social worker who dedicated her life to helping children find loving homes. The truth wouldn't emerge for months. On November 11, 1950, Judge Camille Kelly, the woman who'd been voted one of the 6 most wholesome women in the world, resigned from the bench under pressure from the continuing investigation. She never faced criminal charges. She never publicly admitted wrongdoing. She simply retired, claiming she wanted to spend more time with family, and lived quietly in Memphis until her death years later. The Tennessee Children's Home Society was permanently closed. but closing the facility didn't undo the damage. Couldn't bring back the dead children, couldn't reunite the separated families, couldn't erase the trauma of thousands of people whose entire identities had been built on lies. And that's where this story takes its most disturbing turn. In the immediate aftermath of Georgia Tann's death and the closure of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, Tennessee officials faced a choice: expose the full scope of the scandal or protect the state's reputation. They chose protection over truth. Under pressure from influential families, including some who'd adopted children through Georgia's organization, Tennessee officials made a decision that would haunt survivors for decades. They sealed the adoption records, they classified the investigation files, they destroyed thousands of pages of documents that could have helped families reunite. The official explanation was privacy. They needed to protect adoptive families who'd participated in good faith, children who'd built lives with new identities, biological families who might not want to be found. But the real reason, according to later testimony from officials involved in the decision, was embarrassment. Tennessee didn't want the world to know that its child welfare system had been corrupt from top to bottom, that its most celebrated social worker had been a child trafficker, that one of its most respected judges had facilitated kidnapping, so they buried the truth. For the families torn apart by Georgia Tann's operation, this institutional cover-up was a second betrayal. Mothers who'd spent decades believing their children were dead discovered that those children might be alive somewhere, adopted under different names, living in different states. But the sealed records meant they had no way to find them. Adoptees who'd always felt something was wrong, who'd been told stories about their origins that didn't quite make sense, couldn't access the files that would tell them who they really were. The state essentially said, "The past is the past, move on, forget," but trauma doesn't forget, and slowly, painfully, survivors began to speak. One of the first public accounts came in 1990, when the Los Angeles Times published the story of Alma Sipple. In the spring of 1946, Georgia Tann had taken Alma's daughter Irma under the pretense of providing medical care for the child's pneumonia. A few days later, Tann informed Alma that Irma had died and had already been buried. Alma was devastated. She mourned her daughter for 44 years, but Irma hadn't died. She'd been sold to a family in California, raised under a different name, told her biological mother had abandoned her. When Alma Sipple finally discovered the truth in 1990, that her daughter had been alive all those decades, living just a few hundred miles away, the reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. They'd lost 44 years, 4 decades of birthdays, holidays, ordinary moments, all stolen by Georgia Tann's lies. And Alma and Irma were lucky. They found each other. Most families never did. As more survivors came forward in the 1990s and 2000s, a fuller picture emerged of what life had been like inside the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Former residents described conditions that would qualify as torture under any reasonable definition. Children were kept in overcrowded dormitories, sometimes 40 or 50 to a room. Food was inadequate: thin soup, stale bread, rarely enough to satisfy hungry children. Sick children were isolated but rarely treated, left to recover or die largely on their own. Discipline was brutal. Children who cried were beaten. Children who wet the bed were hung in dark closets for hours. Children who talked back were starved for days or weeks. And sexual abuse pervaded the institution, with Georgia Tann herself among the perpetrators, along with some of her male employees and, in some cases, prospective adoptive parents who were allowed to test out children before committing to adoption. Let that sink in for a moment. Children were given to adults on a trial basis, sometimes for weeks, to see if the adults liked them. If the adults decided the child wasn't suitable, the child was returned to the orphanage, often traumatized by whatever had happened during the trial period, and the process would repeat with new prospective parents. Children weren't people in Georgia Tann's system. They were commodities, products, inventory. But even knowing all this, there remained one question that haunted investigators and survivors alike. How many children died? The official death certificates documented just over 100 deaths at the Tennessee Children's Home Society between 1945 and 1950. But those were only the deaths that were officially recorded. Former employees testified that many more children died without proper documentation. Bodies were removed quickly, buried in unmarked graves, or disposed of in ways that left no records. Some employees believed the actual death toll might be in the hundreds or even thousands. We'll likely never know the true number. The records that might have told us were destroyed. In 2010, a woman named Devero Devi, Bruch-Eiler, published a memoir titled No Mama, I Didn't Die: My Life as a Stolen Baby. Eiler had been kidnapped by Georgia Tann as an infant and adopted by a family in another state. She grew up knowing she was adopted, but believing her biological mother was dead or had abandoned her. As an adult, she discovered the truth and eventually reunited with her birth family. Her memoir became one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of Georgia Tann's operation, documenting not just her own experience, but patterns she'd uncovered through years of research and interviews with other survivors. Eiler's work revealed something crucial. Georgia Tann hadn't just trafficked children within the United States. She'd created international connections, placing children in Canada, Mexico, and potentially South America. The scope was even larger than investigators had imagined, and there was another disturbing discovery. Georgia had maintained detailed records of her operation. She was meticulous, almost obsessive, about documentation. She kept photographs of every child who passed through her facility, notes on their origins, details about where they'd been placed, how much she'd charged, who'd been paid off. After her death, these records were supposedly turned over to state authorities. They vanished. Whether deliberately destroyed or simply lost to bureaucratic incompetence, the very documents that could have reunited thousands of families disappeared into the Tennessee government's archives, never to be seen again. The state's actions, or inactions in the aftermath of Georgia Tann's death amount to a second crime against the victims. By sealing records, destroying evidence, and refusing to facilitate reunions, Tennessee essentially chose to protect institutions over people, reputation over justice, convenience over truth. But survivors refused to stay silent. In 1995, the Tennessee General Assembly passed the Tennessee Adoption Records Access Law, finally allowing some adoptees to access their original birth certificates. It was a partial victory. The law contained numerous restrictions and exceptions, but it was progress. For the first time, people who'd been adopted through Georgia Tann's operation had a legal mechanism to discover their true identities. The reunions that followed were simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. Adult children meeting elderly mothers who'd spent lifetimes mourning them. Siblings discovering each other after 60 or 70 years apart. People learning their real names, their real birthdays, their real family histories. But for every successful reunion, there were dozens of cases where the truth came too late. Mothers who died still believing their children were dead. Children who'd lived their entire lives with false identities, never knowing the truth. Siblings who'd been separated as toddlers and never found each other. And then there were the adoptees who discovered their adoptions had been legitimate, that their biological mothers truly had surrendered them voluntarily or died young, and who felt estranged. mixture of relief and disappointment. They'd built their identities around being Georgia Tann's victims, and discovering they weren't felt oddly invalidating of the trauma they'd experienced. Because here's the thing about Georgia Tann's legacy that we need to understand. Even the children who weren't kidnapped, even the adoptions that were technically legal, were still tainted by the corrupt system she'd created. Children in her care were commodified, photographed like products in a catalog, sold to the highest bidder regardless of whether those families were actually suitable parents. The trauma of being treated as merchandise, of being valued only for your adoptability, affected everyone who passed through her facility. Several survivors described a particular kind of psychological damage, the sense of being fundamentally unmoored from reality. When your entire identity is based on lies, when even your name and birthday might be fabrications, when the basic facts of your existence can't be trusted, it creates a persistent feeling of unreality that therapy can address but never fully resolve. One woman, speaking in her 70s, described it this way: "I still sometimes wonder if anything about me is real. My parents, my adoptive parents, they loved me, I know that. But was I really born? In 1943, was my birth mother really Irish, like they told me? Did I really have siblings? Every fact about my early life is suspect. It's like building a house on quicksand. Nothing feels solid." This existential uncertainty became a defining feature of the Tann survivors' experience. By 2005, investigators and historians had compiled enough evidence to estimate the full scope of Georgia Tann's operation. The numbers are staggering. Approximately 5,000 children trafficked between 1924 and 1950. Somewhere between 500 and 1,000 children who died in her care, though the actual number could be significantly higher. Over $1 million in profits again, the equivalent of roughly $16 million in modern currency, generated through child sales, with the money distributed among Georgia, Judge Kelly, various officials, and the operation's other participants. But these numbers, as horrifying as they are, don't capture the full impact. Because Georgia Tann didn't just destroy individual families. She fundamentally damaged public trust in adoption, in child welfare systems, in the very idea that institutions designed to protect children could be trusted. And she did something else, something that took decades to understand fully. She pioneered many of the techniques that would later be used by international adoption traffickers, by baby selling rings in other states, by criminal organizations that recognized the profitability of exploiting desperate parents and vulnerable children. The methods she developed, separating mothers from newborns in hospitals, forging death certificates, creating false paper trails, bribing officials, targeting poverty-stricken families, became a blueprint for child trafficking operations worldwide. Georgia Tann's legacy isn't just the individual families she destroyed. It's the entire corrupt system she proved was possible. Yet here's where the story becomes even more complicated, even more morally disturbing. Some of the children Georgia Tann placed did thrive with their adoptive families. They grew up in comfortable homes, received good educations, lived successful lives. Many maintained close relationships with their adoptive parents, even after discovering the truth about their origins. When faced with the choice between their adoptive family and their biological family, many chose to maintain both relationships, or to prioritize the family that had raised them. This created impossible emotional conflicts. How do you reconcile gratitude toward adoptive parents with rage at the system that stole you? How do you love the family that raised you while mourning the family you were taken from? How do you think about Georgia Tann as the monster who trafficked you, or as the person who inadvertently connected you with a loving family? There are no easy answers to these questions. The survivors who have spoken publicly describe living with these contradictions, holding multiple truths simultaneously. I was stolen. I was loved. I am angry. I am grateful. I want justice. I want peace. This emotional complexity is what makes Georgia Tann's story so disturbing. If every adoption had been a horror story, the moral judgment would be simple, but some weren't. Some children genuinely were better off with their adoptive families than they might have been with their biological families struggling in poverty. And Georgia Tann knew this. She could point to success stories, to happy families, to children who'd been saved from lives of deprivation. The question isn't whether some good came from Georgia Tann's operation. Clearly it did, for some children. The question is whether that good in any way justifies the means. And the answer, obviously, is no. You don't build a legitimate child welfare system on kidnapping, forgery, and the deaths of hundreds of children. But Georgia Tann believed the ends justified the means. She truly thought she was doing good work. And that unwavering conviction in her own righteousness is perhaps the most frightening thing about her, because it raises an uncomfortable truth about human nature. The most devastating crimes are often committed by people who believe they're helping, by people who have convinced themselves that their victims are better off, that they know what's best, that the suffering they're causing is justified by the greater good they're achieving. Georgia Tann wasn't a monster. She was a human being with a mission, a vision, a sense of purpose. She was intelligent, educated, socially skilled. She was, by all accounts, charming and persuasive when she needed to be. She genuinely believed that children belonged with wealthy, educated parents rather than poor, struggling ones. And that belief, that fundamental devaluation of poor families' humanity and rights, enabled her to commit atrocities for 26 years while maintaining her reputation as a humanitarian. The system that enabled Georgia Tann wasn't just corrupt officials and forged documents. It was a social structure that assigned value to people based on their economic status, that saw poverty as moral failure, that believed children were better off separated from poor parents even against those parents' wishes. Georgia Tann didn't invent these attitudes. She just understood how to exploit them for profit. In 2013, the Tennessee State Library and Archives finally began the process of digitizing and making available some of the Tennessee Children's Home Society records that had survived. Researchers, genealogists, and surviving family members could access these files, though many crucial documents remained missing or restricted. The project uncovered new information about specific cases, identified additional children who'd been trafficked, helped facilitate more reunions. But it also confirmed what survivors had suspected. Many records had been deliberately destroyed, files had been purged, documentation had been lost. The historical record of Georgia Tann's operation will forever be incomplete. We'll never know all the children she trafficked. We'll never know all the families she destroyed. We'll never know everyone who participated in or profited from her operation. And that incompleteness is itself a form of injustice. Today, in Memphis, there are no monuments to Georgia Tann, no historical markers, no plaques. The building that housed the Tennessee Children's Home Society was demolished decades ago. The graves of the children who died in her care remain mostly unmarked, scattered across various cemeteries, their deaths unacknowledged by any official memorial. But in homes across America, and in Canada, Mexico, and beyond, there are families still living with Georgia Tann's legacy. Elderly adoptees still searching for biological relatives. Descendants of biological families still wondering what happened to the aunts or uncles who disappeared in childhood. Adoptive families grappling with the knowledge that their family trees were built on crimes. The trauma reverberates through generations. Children who grew up never quite feeling secure, never quite trusting institutions, passing that anxiety to their own children. Biological siblings who were separated as toddlers, raised in different states with different identities, discovering each other in old age and mourning the decades they lost. Biological mothers who carried guilt and grief until their deaths, believing they'd somehow failed their children, never knowing their children had been stolen. This is Georgia Tann's real legacy, not the number of children she trafficked or the money she made, but the generations of people whose lives were fundamentally shaped by her crimes, by her certainty, by her conviction that she knew better than poor mothers what their children needed. And here's the question we need to confront. Could it happen again? The specific circumstances that enabled Georgia Tann, the lack of oversight in adoption systems, the ease of forging documents, the concentration of power in a few corrupt officials, have largely been addressed. Modern adoption is more regulated, more transparent, more accountable. But the underlying attitudes that made Georgia Tann's operation possible are still very much with us. We still judge parents based on economic status. We still assume that material advantages automatically mean better parenting. We still have systems that disproportionately remove children from poor families, from minority families, from families that don't conform to middle-class norms. The child welfare system today is not Georgia Tann's operation, but the philosophical foundation, the idea that some people's poverty disqualifies them from raising their own children, still influences policy, still shapes decisions, still results in families being unnecessarily separated. Georgia Tann's story isn't just history. It's a warning about what happens when we allow institutions to value children as commodities, when we privilege wealth over family bonds, when we trust authority without demanding accountability. The story of Georgia Tann remains one of the darkest chapters in American child welfare history, not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about our capacity to ignore suffering when it's inflicted on people we've decided don't matter. 5,000 children trafficked, hundreds dead, thousands of families destroyed, and for 2.5 decades, almost nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, they didn't care enough to intervene. But questions remain, questions that haunt survivors and researchers to this day. How many children actually died in Georgia Tann's care? The official count is 106. Former employees believe it was hundreds more. We'll never know for certain. Who else profited from the operation? We know about Judge Kelly. We have strong evidence about certain Memphis officials. But what about the network of doctors, lawyers, nurses, and politicians who made the system run? Most were never identified, never investigated, never held accountable. Where are all the records? Thousands of pages of documentation existed at Georgia's death. Most vanished. Were they deliberately destroyed to protect powerful families? Lost through bureaucratic negligence? Hidden in archives we haven't discovered? The truth might still exist somewhere, waiting. Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is part of the punishment we deserve for allowing such atrocities to unfold in plain sight. To this day, survivors of Georgia Tann's operation gather at occasional reunions, sharing stories, comparing experiences, helping each other navigate the lifelong trauma of being stolen. They're elderly now, in their 70s and 80s and 90s, their voices growing fewer each year. But they still carry the weight of what happened to them, still search for missing siblings, still try to piece together identities that were deliberately fragmented. And on certain nights in Memphis, when researchers work late in the Tennessee State Library and Archives, scrolling through digitized records of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, they report a particular kind of emotional weight that settles over them. Most dismiss it as the natural sadness of reading about children who suffered. The exhaustion of processing tragedy after tragedy, name after name, life after life destroyed. But some know it's something else. The accumulated grief of thousands of families, soaked into documents, preserved in photographs, waiting to be acknowledged. If this journey through one of America's most carefully hidden crimes resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering how we measure the value of a human life, how we decide which families deserve to stay together and which can be torn apart for profit, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about authority and trust that history tries to bury. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question how we protect children or fail to protect them when profit is involved. And in the comments, I want to know, if you had lived in Memphis between 1924 and 1950, would you have noticed what Georgia Tann was doing? Would you have said something? Or would you, like most people, have accepted the official story that she was a respected social worker doing important work? Would you have looked more closely at the children who kept disappearing? Would you have questioned why one orphanage had such a horrifying death rate? Would you have challenged a respected institution, risked your reputation, demanded accountability? Or would you have looked away? Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to see ourselves clearly. Georgia Tann succeeded for 26 years not because she was particularly brilliant, but because people chose not to see, chose not to question, chose to trust authority over their own moral instincts, and sometimes that willingness to look away. That's the darkness we're really afraid of. The darkness in ourselves.